All right. So I'll do a little intro, and then we'll just get right into things. And then whether or not I feel like it, this part will be edited in to make it sound more awkward and cringy.
Yeah.
Anyways, welcome back to Japanophiles, the irregularly scheduled, not podcast sort of video thing, to all 50 of you that consistently watch this. Thank you very much. Today we're going to be talking about Mamoru Oshii's... What year was this? This was like, what,
2006 to 2008, somewhere in there.
2008. I'm going to go with 2008,
yeah.
And then at some point we'll just correct it. If there's a sudden jump cut, it's not 2008.
Yeah.
Mamoru Oshii's 2008 film Sky Crawlers. And today with me I have a very special guest. How do you want to be introduced, first of all?
Just call me Argenbolt. I've been called that so long that it's indistinguishable. If I lost my memories but remembered that name, I'd probably think that was probably just my name.
That is the perfect introduction to Argenbolt, honestly. You may remember him from a certain Muv-Love video that is also up on my channel.
Yeah.
It's insane. It's so genius. It's so fucking genius.
But he is also one of the biggest plane guys I know, having seen all of UK Kaze at least once.
At least 7.
8, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know.
He draws planes, he draws women, it's Argenbolt.
Yeah.
So I figure we should get right into it, but before we actually start off, I want to give a spoiler warning, because Skycrawlers is a movie that hinges on one very specific twist, and I feel like we're not going to be able to talk about the movie without talking about the twist.
You need to walk back and forth over it a lot, that's for sure.
Yeah. Right away, Argenbolt, would you recommend Skycrawlers?
On a blank entry, if you're a fan of one of 3 things, World War II general plane dogfighting, done pretty well for an anime, anything Mamoru Oshii feeling that's like long and has a dog in it, probably a basset hound, and I guess probably if you're like, it's gonna sound kind of strange, but if you're big into what I'm going to describe as Ace Combat style plane stories, where it's the emphasis is not necessarily on realism, but on a kind of dramatic twist of working with planes, killing with planes, living with planes, something planes, I'd say you'd probably enjoy this.
All right, yeah, that's perfect. So any of that sounds interesting, turn off the video now. We'll put all the ads before everything. And go and watch Skycrawlers, then come back to this video. We'll still be here. Because, yes, it is a great movie. I would say it's one of Oshii's most underrated movies.
I'd agree, yeah.
Yeah, but it hinges on this twist, and it's not a bad movie for hinging on this twist. Skycrawlers is about our main character, Yui Chi, who is a pilot in the midst of this war, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically. And it's about him. He comes to this air base, and he meets Kusanagi, who the main crux of the plot ends up being about their relationship together. And
so I know it's early, but I just want to touch on how kind of, I don't know if this is the same in the original books, but there is kind of a completely on the nose reference in the fact that a previous important character has either the last name or the surname Jinro, and the base commander has the name Kusanagi.
Kusanagi, yeah. I actually have that too in my notes.
It was weird how calmly they were saying that, and I was just like, damn, for Oshii, that's like truly we are the Sky Crawlers. Levels of kind of in your face. But anyway.
We start off, we are entering spoilers now, officially.
Yes.
We start off, Yui Chi arrives at the base. And to anyone that has seen this movie before, this is my second time going through the movie.
Same for me, yeah.
For this. The absolute horror that I experienced when Yui Chi goes to the base and is greeted by the mechanic. Their exchange goes something like, haven't seen a female mechanic before? And then Yui Chi says, I have, somewhere. And right off the bat, the film has telegraphed to you that Yui Chi has gone through these events before in some previous life, in some previous form.
See, I got tipped off roughly to that, not on the mechanic, but on the way he lit his match, on the way he would pop his cigarette out with one hand, put it in his mouth. He doesn't need to. He can put his parachute case down, but he specifically has to do a cool pop the cigarette out and light a match with one hand. And it's like that already, like that takes practice and like a lot of practice. practice. And if you do that after every sortie in your plane, then you've clearly done a lot of sorties and you've lit a lot of cigarettes with one hand, you know?
For people that don't care about spoilers and are still here, I guess we should explain the concept of children and how horrible it is.
There's a kind of cloned non-person. They're not regarded as like humans. They definitely don't get the same civil rights or human
They
rights.
can't age.
Can't age, which is a benefit.
They're
but
stuck at
all
the
of
same mid-teens.
Yeah, kind of weird, like 14 to 18,
Yeah.
somewhere in there. However, even though they're immortal, they come with this downside of they're all funneled into this war. I presume that both sides of the war has these fighters on their side. It's not made explicitly clear about the antagonizing force.
There are implications. They make a point to say that teacher is not a children, and that,
in comparison, that makes sense.
that implies that the rest of the people on that side happen to be children.
It's kind of a freaky kind of idea. I don't know if we'll get to that in a bit where they kind of justify it, but it is kind of this, it is like the most proxy war you can have, where it's not even like you're using another country of, well, they're still humans, but it's another country you're getting to fight for you. They're literally getting non-people to fight for them. It's devoid, presumably, of any actual casualties for the enemy country or for the friendly country whatsoever. So that's kind of an interesting but kind of freaky concept.
If you watch Skycrawlers for the first time, you might be frustrated at not knowing exactly why there's this conflict going on and what sides are involved, but you have just as much information as Yui Chi does at the very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, as well, the nature of the conflict isn't one grounded in any real war or any actual serious warfare. So that's kind of the point. There might not be any actual stakes at all, realistically. There's nothing that really gives it away that could even be an issue, right?
Yeah. So moving along in terms of plot, Yui Chi meets his fellow wingmates, including Tokino and I have his name somewhere here. Oh yeah, Aizu. I'm just gonna mention these guys for later. Basically,
there's a scene where if you get confused, he refers to, I think it's Aizu if he has the white hair, as Westy. That's his call sign for some reason, but that's who he's referring to. It's not there isn't another secret pilot with a weird name. That's just his call sign that he refers to him as on their sortie together.
Yui Chi and Tokino go to a brothel, essentially.
Yeah.
Now, other than reminding me of the script for Holes written by the guy that wrote Donnie Darko,
which includes a brothel visit as well.
Yes. Other than reminding me of that, this scene is very interesting to me. Yui Chi goes to a bar, gets picked up, brought to a brothel, has sex, is smoking after sex, and that's when he plays the kid card. He's smoking, and they're talking, and at one point he just goes, "Well, yeah, I'm still a kid after all."
Yeah, I mean, specifically, it's something that comes up a lot in Japanese media. Of they shift the prefix from an ore to a boku, so they go from the adult like me to a kind of like kiddie like me, and it's kind of funny.
Oh, but then at the same time, he also refers to her in a way that would make her younger than him.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny, like, it's not really that complex. It's just a funny, like, the perception now that after they've done the grown-up thing, now they're talking to each other, or at least he is talking in a kiddie fashion, which is kind of weird.
It's interesting, and it happens early on, and this is supposed to kind of give you this outlook of Yui Chi's personality and how at the same time he can be an adult, he'll still then pull back and shift into being a kid when it fits him, when he suits his needs.
It's one of the things that really does get developed through the movie a lot, is that his personal perception of his life is not very great. It's not fixed. He has these moments where, like, he could say, like, oh, he's just being clever, but it comes off more as a kind of sad, like, how, like, do these children who, you know, are however many years old, how much do they really perceive themselves as one thing or the other? Mm-hmm. Or is it almost like a mental illness where they're like, you know, they're constantly transferring between the, like, I'm like 12 to, you know, I shoot people down and kill them and I sleep with grown women, now I'm an adult. Like, it's a weird kind of like a Schrodinger's cat kind of existence where it's not super well fixed.
What I noticed in a lot of scenes is that doors are fucking huge in this movie.
Oh, absolutely. There's an emphasis on big fucking doors.
A lot of the furniture is not exaggeratedly big, but is much larger than the character using it. Mm-hmm. And so you have this world of children acting as adults. You got a kid fucking lighting up a cigarette as soon as he hops out of an airplane. It deliberately puts them next to these things to show how small they actually are in comparison to their actions, to what they're doing.
See, that's where I want to bring up a funny plane idea. So if you want to become a pilot or interested in just pilot anatomy, there's a hard limit on the height that pilots can be. And it's not because just tall pilots require big, expensive seats. That's one of the factors, but that's not it. One of the main factors is that the human heart doesn't actually change in size too much. So as a human gets taller and taller and taller, the heart actually has to do a bit more work. So this is kind of why smaller end people are usually selected for astronauts and jet fighter pilots. And so I kind of wonder if maybe this was more of an issue or more of an idea in the original books, but the idea was partially, oh, these pilots are smaller. It'll cost less fuel to get them in a plane and carry their weight. And also because they're smaller, assuming their hearts are full grown, because our hearts do develop much faster than our brains, because it just has to pump blood. It doesn't have to mature or anything. That maybe physiologically they'd be better and younger and more predisposed to surviving injury. And if they're like eternally children, maybe healing as well is also like much greatly improved. The hard cap for pilots is usually around your late 30s to early 40s, where you just can't physiologically compete, and your reflexes degrade as well, which is another issue.
Well, they do make a point much later on in the movie. Basically, if a children is not killed, they're just not going to die.
Yeah.
And you have a workforce of perfect cross-section of pilots that will just never die until they are killed.
Well, this was the really disturbing thing, is that as it's mentioned later on in the movie, during the kind of the broader explanation of where the children come from, they explain that it was kind of an accident, that it was a byproduct of trying to extend either youth or trying to extend life, and they kind of accidentally ended up with this presumably immortal pilot force. And so there's almost like a morbid kind of sense of humor to it, where maybe these children weren't purposefully created to be pilots. It was almost like an accident. It was almost like, oh shoot.
And then somebody says like, oh, that...
Yeah, well, hey, you have immortal kids that can fit in planes and do plane things forever and never get old, and never have their reflexes degrade, and you kind of like, you don't want to treat them as people because they're this weird immortal race of freaks. We have an endless war going on. Can we have some of these? These sound perfect for our needs. And that's kind of
perfect for our endless war, our endless proxy battles.
Yeah, it's an almost even more nightmarish than some scientist wants to make the ultimate soldier. It's just, it's like, oh no, we stocked too much of the Immortal Kid products. What do we do? It's like, send them to the war factory. I guess that works. That gets rid of them.
Yeah, and going into part of this, the immortal forever children, Peter Pan effect, if you will, we have a very interesting character dynamic that I wonder if it was played around with a little bit more in the books, but Kusanagi has a daughter. She has a daughter by some mystery man somewhere. Somebody. Yeah, but as the first introduction of the daughter, she introduces herself as Kusanagi's sister. She is being brought up thinking that Kusanagi, the airbase captain, is her older sister. And you realize, after you realize that she's the daughter, you realize that very, very soon this daughter is going to grow past her mother's age. That
Presumably.
She is actually going to be physically older than her mother ever will be.
Mm-hmm.
I have cousins who the younger one will fucking sprout up past the older one.
Yeah.
I can't imagine the fucking horror of just like, I can't age and my daughter is going to age before me, and it's going to be a very awkward situation when she's like fucking 30 and I'm still 14.
You kind of think of like Aliens, right? Where Ripley comes back and she's shown these pictures of this old woman, and they have to try to explain to her that like, well, this is your daughter. She's already passed away. It's
an interesting dynamic for Kusanagi, but I think at this point it's also kind of a not a ticking time bomb, but it's the clock. It's slowly coming in. She's seeing, oh no, how much longer can I keep up this life for? And that's going to be expanded on throughout the whole film. But it's the first like crack we see of this. Not everything's going to go well.
Yeah, it's also a hint that it wasn't something approved. This isn't something ideal.
Oh yeah, there's a ton of not just characters outright saying saying that this is something that should never have happened.
It also brings up the kind of interesting question of like the male pilots we see in the story, like the protagonists, like they presumably go to the brothel pretty often. Are they just always using protection? Is like what, it's kind of interesting of like, oh, well, the primary female character, Kusanagi, had this daughter, and yet the male characters seem to go to the brothel very often and don't seem to have the issue. I don't know if that was just a fluke or if they just use good condoms or what it is, but it's kind of it's an interesting idea. They kind of hint at the reason for it in the story a little bit, but it is interesting that there's kind of this, okay, you want to have sex, that's fine, but clearly producing some weird children offspring, as one of the characters said, that's like a kid having a kid. That's not supposed to happen, right?
Yeah, and it's again like, oh, we can send these kids out to war, but when it comes to them actually doing adult things, like going to war, but when it comes to them doing other adult things, it ends up being a problem. And yeah, they're put into this kind of weird place of in between kid and in between adults. Probably one of the most important story beats in the movie is the introduction of our main antagonist, Teacher.
Yeah, Teacher is kind of a very important character.
The scene introducing the Teacher happens right after the airbase is being put on TV. They have to put on a good show. They have to show everybody like, oh yeah, war is great. Do you remember what Yui Chi says?
Yeah. I love fighting. It's something.
Oh yeah, when I shoot down a plane, it feels like I'm winning, and he smiles.
Yeah, I mean, we got kind of a cold introduction of Teacher at the very beginning of the movie, where
we do.
I mean, we don't really know whose plane it is at that point, but it's clear that it's visually and aesthetically different, and so this is kind of the characters catching up with the actions we saw earlier in terms of explaining kind of who is this very, very, very experienced pilot, right?
But Teacher's scene comes right after that, right after basically the protagonist is telling everybody that war feels good, shooting down a enemy plane feels good, and Teacher immediately kills off one of the named protagonists that had a very interesting quirk, made him very memorable.
Well, I mean, I have like a little point to bring up here, which is kind of just the general artificialness of the war itself. Like Teacher, in terms of, he's a character, but in terms of how the war plays out, Teacher is almost like an admin or like a moderator or something.
Well, yeah, that's what that kind of ties into what I was going to mention about this scene, just that there's no fanfare. The Teacher comes in and he shoots down a plane, and that's it. There's no like, this is, look, there goes Teacher. Whoa, I sure would like to fly with him one day.
There's no focus on the character as a character, as like we have to see a Darth Vader shot of a shadowy doorway and Teacher. Like, that's not it. It's treated much more like how in World War II aces were kind of talked about. You didn't experience them. You might have seen like a newspaper with them, maybe, or maybe not at all, but you would hear about this one specific plane or this group of planes that has a ridiculously high kill record. If you see them in battle, get away from them. It's very much something that is kind of an analog to the World War II aerial combat that the series is, or the movie I should say, is drawing from very heavily.
Yeah, and so speaking of which, after Teacher's introduction and the introduction of another character, Matsuya, who we'll mention later, we get the big action scene midway through that I'm willing to bet everybody who went into this movie for planes was like fucking drooling at and waiting for.
Mm-hmm. Like, well, the big operation is kind of a big, like, it is presented as a big focal point, but at the same time it is deflated completely towards the end. You see a lot of planes, things are getting shot, but ultimately the bombers don't drop their bombs, and the operation is called off. But it isn't even called off in a like, it was an absolute defeat of our forces by the enemy. It's almost called off in like okay, whatever.
Yeah, they just do the whole like, return to base, RTV. Mm-hmm. They just pull them back before they can really do anything.
It's kind of interesting. Yeah,
it's the best sort of anticlimax. One thing that I also wanted to mention was that anytime there's a newsreel or there's a newspaper, and the subs that I had at least would just like read out the headline, and the headline itself would cause so many questions that you would just be like, what the hell does the rest of that paper say?
Yeah, one specific that I found funny, I don't know if this is a translation error, but it talked about a meeting between the Canadian president and the American minister. And I had to, like, is it an alternate universe thing, or did they just get the prefixes wrong when they tried to translate it? I don't know. It's a funny idea, that's for sure.
But it's a really underappreciated aspect of Skycrawlers and a lot of Oshii movies is just that there is a world hidden entirely in the background, told all through the design choices and the little background snippets that you get without ever having to like spell things out and be, this is the world, this is the state of everything. We don't get like these are the politics.
Yeah, especially in nature of, like, in the regards to the nature of the conflict they're fighting, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't really be useful.
It would deflate it. Yeah,
it would deflate it because it would put the focus on these bigger things that are happening, when ultimately the entire point of even the war they're fighting isn't about the bigger things. The bigger thing is almost like a joke. The war itself, the tourists that come into their hangar call it a game. They, I think, refer to it as
they refer to it as a game. They refer to it as winning.
Mm-hmm. So this is where I have a much smaller anecdote, but kind of a funny reflection.
Go right ahead.
So the first time I watched this movie, I was playing a game called War Thunder. Now, for the people who don't know about War Thunder is a free-to-play. This isn't an advertisement, by the way. War Thunder is kind of shit. There's the plug, unplugged.
There's the anti-plug. What game should they play if they don't want to play War Thunder?
Oh, probably the Newgrounds Catch the Poo game.
Okay.
That's a full feature. I don't know.
Please buy Skycrawler's Innocent Aces on the Wii. I hear it's very good.
Yeah, so it's a very grindy game. It's a game that lets you you get to play all the aircrafts from early World War II, very late 1920s and 30s, all the way through to jets from the very early 1950s and late 1940s. And so that's cool because you don't really get multiplayer games specifically focused on vehicles, or you didn't used to get them. They've become popular over the past couple of years recently. But the game itself was really, really grindy, and it's still really, really grindy in terms of you can do very well, but you will not progress very far because it's a free-to-play. So they're trying to milk you. They're trying to get you to buy planes or custom time, things to speed up your progress. And by progress, I mean when you get a plane, you don't get a plane. You get a bad version of a plane, and you have to spend like a week fighting in matches to try to upgrade it just to get it to an okay place. And then you have to start the whole process over again on the next plane. So it's very grindy. And so the nature of the Children, the first time I saw this movie of these guys who are stuck in this endless war, nobody ever wins. I was playing the German tree in game, which is very it's a difficult tree of planes. You have to know how to fly their planes properly. And if you're starting on a new plane, it can feel like you're just getting shot down by other planes. The other nature of the game is that the way that the multiplayer matches are set up, they usually occur at altitudes that kind of benefit allied planes, like American planes and Russian planes. So it was this kind of surreal experience watching this movie about these, immortal kids flying and getting shot down, and they're replaceable, but they never age, and everyone calls it a game. And then at the same time, I was playing this game, and I was playing it on a computer whose specs were not very impressive. So I was getting shot down a lot, and I know that I can do a lot better now because I played it on a slightly newer, better computer. So it was like I could sympathize with characters immensely.
On a deeper level than anyone else.
Yeah, I was also early in university, so I was kind of facing that kind of like, oh, what's the point? That kind of blasé.
I think we'll definitely get into that in a little bit. What we should bring up next is Matsuya, the female Children that joins their group much later in the film. She is introduced midway through and only becomes very important in the third act. But there's other important stuff going on with Kusanagi and Yui Chi. There's that scene that they have in the car where they're I don't know what you want to call that, kissing, embracing.
I mean, like
he's holding back the gun.
Yeah,
more importantly than anything that's going on with their mouths.
High stakes French kissing is maybe what I want to call it. High tension. The female, I guess she's like they kind of refer to her as an ace, and she talks like she knows what we're talking about. She almost feels like the active protagonist that like showed up late to the movie. Like
that's the thing,
late, right?
Is that the group that they're in, the whole squadron or whatever, has fallen so into routine and consistency. Matsuya joining completely shakes things up. She is a rogue element in the group.
She feels like an active protagonist. She feels like somebody who knows things, wants to change the status quo permanently for the better, which is what I think most protagonists want. She's good at flying, and it's kind of funny because it shows that in the nature of the conflict they're fighting, like that's almost like the opposite of what you really need. Like in a sense, the war can be completely continued on with mediocre pilots that don't think about anything and just get shot down. She's the opposite. She's something that is aware of the bigger role, sees the war for the kind of joke that it is, and is also like deeply disturbed at her own personal nature as being an immortal, expendable children pilot, and is kind of rightfully, she's about the only character who, if you had a person that suddenly you told you're an immortal, replaceable children pilot, would freak out to a realistic degree. The other characters are completely blasé.
Well, that's the interesting part, is that if they don't already know, they almost certainly already suspect, and they are doing nothing.
I mean, we can't really get too deeply into the relationship without really touching on the kind of the big twist, right?
Yeah.
Like that's kind of the imperative.
I think the best way to approach the big twist, even though we've already the cat's out of the bag as far as this video is concerned, is bring up the newest member of their group after Matsuya joins, Hada, who looks strikingly like Aizu, who was shot down by Teacher earlier, and even has the same exact mannerisms. And upon seeing this, it immediately triggers the Oshi scenery point of the movie.
Yeah,
for
which
Yui
is
Chi.
Without
even saying a word, you freak out as an audience member.
Especially when you have characters that are talking constantly about, I don't know if I've been here before, maybe I have. I mean, in the beginning of the movie, when you don't really know a lot about their war as well, you could kind of think well, maybe they've been fighting very long. The nature of even before you hear about what specifically the children are, you could just be forgiven for believing that it's a World War II-ish scenario that's dragged so long that you have young conscription happening. That could happen. That was something that happened in the real world, is that even before they had conscription, younger people who were motivated by propaganda or just their civic duty or whatever they felt like, they wanted to get a hot girlfriend, whatever, would join into the war. And it's sad, but it's not unreasonable. There's a historical precedent for it. Once you learn more and more and more about the world, about the nature of the kind of joke of a conflict they're fighting, and about their own kind of very kind of tragic and nightmarish existence as children, that, especially that moment where you see the replacement pretty much happen, is pretty freaky. It is.
Yeah.
it kind of hints that maybe none of this, it's kind of like the Cylon question in Battlestar Galactica, where anybody could be a Cylon, except now everyone definitely is probably a Cylon.
Well, it's not only that you're finding out you're expendable, because you knew that going into the war. It's finding out that you're replaceable as a human being. That people will throw around the term existential horror.
Yeah.
And Skycrawlers is one of the most literal existential horror movies that is out there, at least as far as anime is concerned, because the crux of it is Yui Chi's existence. As the second you see Aizu's replacement, it calls into question, there's that Jinro guy that Yui Chi's an awful lot like, or at least people compare him to.
Well,
shit.
The Jinro comparison is especially creepy because I think they say something like he had 63 sorties or something. The Jinro guy is his previous, I don't know, I guess you could just call it even a previous incarnation, because
that's something that's really interesting and really important, is that Aizu's replacement, Hada, not only has a different name, similar, but different name, his facial features and voice sound different than Aizu's. It's not a perfect, this is a exact clone.
Yeah.
It's almost just different enough to make somebody that knew this person go, you look familiar, but I know you're not the person that I knew before.
It really does bring up this kind of especially within regards to video games, but also in regards to there's many media about the perfect soldier in genetic variation, and also I brought up Battlestar Galactica and the idea that in that the Cylons were organic and they're mortal, they could be killed, but their minds would be uploaded. And so it's kind of the same idea where in that series the enemy space fighters would have their minds re-uploaded over and over and over again if there was the technology for their resurrection was in the proper place and was maintained, because that way their piloting experience could be maintained. And the same function is basically happening here, in that the children, even if they die however they die, their minds have some kind of really nightmarish, because it's completely beyond the technology level we see of these World War II fighting planes and these monochromatic television and these kind of old-timey diners and radios, yet they have the ability to store the collective experience and fighting techniques of a pilot and just plug them into what is presumably grown from fresh or has some kind of next generation feature to it.
And there's also the question of how much are they retaining. They obviously retain, because it's important to the people in charge, they obviously retain all of their skills and pilot experience, but how much do they actually retain of memories they had in their past life is up to debate. Matsuya, who we were talking about earlier, mentions that she has memories of basically the entire fucking secret plot of like, oh, I remember that somebody told me that we are ageless and we can't die and we're replaceable. I have no idea who told me that, but I've always had this information with me.
Yeah, see, that's one of the things that I think is interesting, specifically in regards to maybe a bit of like a World War II kind of idea, is that as the war in, Europe and just, in the Pacific as well dragged on, planes were replaceable. Planes weren't the issue. The thing that was really lost with prolonged air combat was experience. When you lost an experienced pilot, you lost a wealth of information. And that's why the Allies did better and better and better as the war went on, because they had the advantage of they could take their aces, bring them home, train new pilots, and cycle them through and get that experience redistributed to as many people as possible, whereas the defeated nations couldn't keep that. They had to keep putting their ace pilots up in the air over and over and over again, essentially until they were shot down. And so that's why in this, you wonder, like, these kids look so young initially, before you know anything, how do they go through pilot training, even just the way he lights his cigarette, like he's clearly done this a lot, but how old could these kids realistically be? You need, like, ideally 4 to 10 years of good flying experience, in a really ideal sense, at least a couple months. And so in a nightmarish way, this sidesteps the entire problem and just goes, no, don't worry, you can get shot down, you can die, or whatever. We'll just plug your memories into the next person. The experiences are never really lost, and that's kind of scary in and of itself.
It's like this sort of horrible twist you would see in a Twilight Zone episode. Horrible in the sense of like, holy shit, that's a fuck.
I mean, it does, for me, it brings up the kind of interesting question, and it's kind of something that kind of garners a bit of hope towards the end of the movie, is that, well, if they are amassing collective experience and collective knowledge, right? Teacher serves as a kind of unbeatable foe now, but Teacher is basically playing, like, Teacher is almost like a video game enemy, and he's playing against like what would ostensibly be like a representation of like a player, because a player is immortal, and a player can try and get shot down over and over and over again. And in the same way that a player could maybe learn to look at the patterns of how the boss moves, or remember, what their weaknesses are, Teacher, as a, I guess like I can say the spoilers, that he's not a children, he's a normal human who's already should be suffering from some kind of life expectancy just in terms of reaction times as a pilot. You're facing like an almost nightmarish enemy that you can shoot down time and time again, but it doesn't matter because they'll always come back and they'll remember their piloting experience. So that's kind of something I think that towards the end of the movie offers a bit of hope, is that hypothetically, maybe they'll get to a point where they can shoot him down. Even in his souped up plane and even with his experience, he'll get old enough and they'll have hopefully lived enough renditions, whatever pilot manages to do it, that they can actually take him out.
But then the real question is, like, what next?
What next?
Then they're just going to perpetuate this cycle.
I think Yui Chi says it to Kusanagi at that point later in the movie, where he says, you have to live on. You have to live on so that there is somebody who is conscious of everything and who doesn't get that diluted sense of memory.
Yeah, actually, let's talk about that scene. Let's talk about that in more detail. So it's one of my favorite scenes in the movie, and it's one of the very last scenes. It's kind of the culmination of Kusanagi and Yui Chi's relationship, now that basically everything's out in the open to Yui Chi, Kusanagi having known beforehand. Over the course of the movie, it's revealed that Kusanagi killed her previous lover/pilot, Jinro, and Yui Chi is the reincarnation or clone of Jinro. And so he goes into her office to see Matsuya pointing a gun at Kusanagi. He takes the gun away, literally saying, give me the gun, I'll be the one to shoot her.
Yeah.
Not in any malice or anything.
It's clear that they don't hate each other, but they're stuck in this no-win situation where even suicide doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, if they get their head stuck in a wood chipper, they're going to come back as like a weird incarnation.
He takes the gun away, and then it's just the two of them. And as established earlier, Kusanagi has a gun, and they're basically in a standoff almost. But it's not really a standoff of who's going to kill who. It's, I want you to kill me. It's Kusanagi telling Yui Chi to kill her. And the interesting part for me is that, yes, it's not a suicide attempt because she knows that she's going to be back there the next week. She knows that there's going to be a replacement her just cycled right back in. It's literally just, I don't want to live with this information anymore. I want to like reset things. I want to go back to what I had before.
Oh, see, that's something that kind of gave me a funny idea, was the fact that she even made it to like a base commander when it was clear that the children, they were originally designated designated as pilots, right? That was probably their primary goal. And a base commander doesn't, like, if you're a CAG, if you're an air group commander, you don't need to fly necessarily. You can just be planning sorties. The fact that she is a commander is kind of freaky because it's almost implying that even the control positions of this war are slowly being automated and given over to, I mean, she might be an exception. It might not be the rule. Maybe the rest of the base commanders are still, quote unquote, normal people or whatever. But it is kind of like, that's another thing. So with the experience building up as well, for her, there's also the kind of implication that like the war is slowly automating itself to the point where the children might just be controlling everything, right?
Yeah. And I think the specific thing that Yui Chi says to Kusanagi is live on until we can change something, which is basically, that's the thesis of the movie, is just this idea that you're in this cycle that you seemingly can't break out of. This then leads to our last scene. And again, one of my favorite scenes in any Oshi movie is the tell-all line of Yui Chi saying, "I'll kill my father," and then going off to fight Teacher. Because to Yui Chi, nothing is going to change until they can conquer Teacher. Because Teacher represents this sort of like...
This kind of, this impenetrable barrier. I mean, literally, because he's an adult, it's an impenetrable barrier of adulthood that they can't even get to. Physiologically, they can't become adults. But also, in regards to the metaphor of what the scene is, it's like I am going to try to surpass this barrier, right?
That he's going to actually make some sort of change, hopefully for the better. And does he do it?
He doesn't. I mean,
he doesn't. He dies in one of the top 10 saddest anime deaths.
But once again, for him, that doesn't matter though. The children are the children. It's kind of like that's the nightmarish part about it, is that for Teacher is this unbeatable force, now, but he is presumably a mortal human. And so for him, the clock is actually ticking, and every time he shoots down one of these planes that has one of these aces in it, it's almost like this kind of sounds like a funny comparison, but it's almost like playing against like an amiibo, where except the amiibo is an immortal, unaging kid that is brought back time and time and time again. Realistically, he does some crazy maneuvers, Teacher, but if he is a human and he is aging normally, even just piloting in general can put a huge amount of strain and can take years off your life if you're, even if you're a really great pilot, it can severely like limit you. And you're fighting an immortal reincarnating child warrior race. They don't want to be immortal, they don't want to be children, but that's kind of funny in and of itself, right? That for now he won, but I think the implication is that given enough time, like he will inevitably lose. It's not possible for him as a normal human. The war has progressed past, like realistically, and also not at all a metaphor, past humanity. It's no longer even a human war in the sense of the humans aren't even fighting it, the humans aren't dying in it, right?